Hello, everybody. You've got to look at my face just one more time. I have the great pleasure to introduce Andrew McAfee, one of the co-founders of the MIT Initiative for the Digital Economy, who is going to facilitate the discussion on platforms, power, and geopolitics. Andy's work has explored the big question of how does technology change X, where X has evolved over time. He's the author or co-author of The Geek Way, More from Less, Second Machine Age, Machine Platform Crowd. You might need a couple more minutes if I'm going to keep naming all of them, and I think he's shaking his head and saying, let's get on with it. So very excited for him to join us and to get the next conversation going.
Thanks. And I want to I want to invite longtime friend of the IDE and longtime friend of mine, Alan Davidson, to come and join me. While he's making his way to the chair, I'm going to start introducing him because the full thing would take a very long time. Alan was, among several other things, he was the first Google hire in public policy in 2005.
Yep.
So you kind of led that charge of Silicon Valley goes to Washington.
Right. Not quite early enough to be, my wife says a year earlier pre-IPO would have been nice. But it was a great time to be joining Google. Yeah, and it was a simpler time back then.
Then you spent time in the Obama administration in the Commerce Department as the head of digital commerce, whatever that was.
Right.
Then the Mozilla Foundation.
Yes, Mozilla the corporation.
Mozilla the corporation. Then back to the Biden administration, where you ran the National Telecommunications and Information Administration.
Wow.
Well
done, well done. Yes, I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Administrator of NTIA. We did like telecom and tech and ran a $50 billion broadband investment program.
And then, as if that weren't all enough, you're now at Databricks, where you are helping them spin up a public policy and governmental affairs organization. Is that about right?
You've got it.
Okay, so with that context, I can't think of a better person to help us wrap up the day and talk about these big swirly issues of power, politics, geopolitics, and technology. What I thought we'd do, let's start close to home and talk about the United States for a bit, and then we'll broaden out our aperture and hopefully get a chance to talk about both our allies and some of our adversaries around the world. We're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. I also hear that you might want to do this as crossfire and throw some questions back my way.
It only seems fair. We've got one of the world's experts on these very topics here.
It's more than fair. So yeah, one of the experts
stuff
not
I've
being
been meaning
me,
to ask you. Yes.
But feel free to bring it back when you want to.
Excellent.
Okay,
and by the way, can I just say, disclaimer, I'm brand new at Databricks. I'm here only speaking in my personal capacity. And I'll just say thank you to our organizers and congratulations, Jeff and Marshall, David, everybody. It's great to be back here at MIT. I'm just sort of a humble MIT computer scientist who fell from grace and became a lawyer.
Okay, so as we're talking, please think if it's sparking any questions. We've got a couple mics. We'll wind up the day with some Q&A. But let's start this final session by talking about the US of A. By any standard, our high-tech industries, our high-tech ecosystem is far and away the best in the world. It's the envy of the world. It puts us in a very nice position when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to national security. It's a really good thing for us to have. We're going to talk about imperfections and things we might need to worry about, but let's first of all say that we have this astonishing technology ecosystem. What's our secret?
Well, it is true that we are the envy of the world. In this job, I had a chance to travel all over the country, all over the world. People ask this question all the time. And even in this moment of geopolitical conflict, I think we are the technology companies that we've created, our place in the technology revolution that's facing the world right now. I think it is the envy of the world, and there's probably, you're an expert on this, but the way I answer that question, I'll tell you how I used to answer that question 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and I hope it's still true. I think there's a number of different things at play. One is we continue to have one of the freest economies, and we are a country that is based in freedom and that has historically attracted the best and the brightest from around the world.
Okay.
We have a university system that is the envy of the world and that we've invested on incredibly. And I think that we've, in the internet space at least, and this is where I'd say 10 years ago I would have said this, and it's interesting if we think it's true. In the internet space at least, we had a set of rules. We had a governance structure that really worked and promoted innovation in a way that other countries didn't adopt. And certainly 15 years ago, as a lot of these companies in the web space, the cloud space were coming up, we had an environment that was really friendly to that. Now, the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is how we want to make sure we're continuing to be that place that's a beacon for talent, that supports a university system that has generated so much of the innovation, and we have a rule space, a governance space. Governance has come up, I know, a bunch of times during the course of the day, a lot. Do we have that governance structure in place that helps support innovation, but also puts the rule space in place that we need to give people confidence and trust, which was another theme. That makes sense. So you're the libertarian. You hate that.
No. Okay. Whether or not, I don't even know what my beliefs are, but I'm going to play frothing at the mouth libertarian for the purposes of this conversation.
Great.
So there are a couple things that I would vehemently agree with. We are a magnet for the world's talent. We have historically been a magnet for the world's talent. I think even the nuttiest libertarians that I have encountered would say good research universities are probably a good thing to have if you want a leading-edge high-tech ecosystem. You said the word freedom. We've been a free country, and this is where the libertarians would start cheering and saying, yeah, we're free from the dead hand of the state. We're free from too much oversight. We're free from congressional committees that love to beat up innovators and entrepreneurs, and they probably would agree with you that that might be going away. So I don't see a huge amount of difference between what you've been saying and this position that I'm trying to caricature.
Right. I'll give two quick things that I think are worthy of our attention. One is my experience in the internet space is, we had a rule space that made sense, and there was a pretty light touch from government. I think now.
Give us an example of what you mean by a rule space.
Well, for example, we don't have a lot of heavy-handed rules around internet governance. We do have rules about intermediary liability, for example. This is a good example. Okay. There's, if you are Google or Facebook, you are not liable for the content in many cases that you are distributing. There were really good reasons why we did that originally, partly to foster innovation, partly because we didn't think there was a kind of responsibility that a Google, or this really came up from ISPs. Like we didn't think ISPs should be responsible for what goes over their pipes. Now in 2025, a lot of people are questioning some of those rules. And I think a lot of people are asking the question, did we adequately figure out, if you were to ask, I travel all over the country in this job I had. People, I would say, regular people, folks sitting around the kitchen table, as we say, in Main Street America, I don't think that they believe that we have necessarily done such a great job at making the internet safe for their kids, at dealing with some of the real problematic content that's online, at protecting their privacy, at protecting their cybersecurity. And I think people around the world don't necessarily think that the US is a beacon of governance right now. Like we didn't do such a great job with social media. So why should we believe you now when you start talking about what the rules should be for AI? And so I think we need to give a hard look at what can we learn from our approach to internet governance and internet policy? What can it teach us about how we tackle the new challenges?
Do you have a couple quick lessons that you believe that we can take away from that?
Well, I think we need to build up our governance muscles. This is a big theme, and I just think coming out of government, I'll tell you, we still lag the muscles to really get ahead of what is happening out there, the challenges that technology is bringing. And I'll say in the US right now, we also, it's a hard moment. We don't really have good habits, I'll put it that way, around let's take on a really hard problem like internet privacy. Let's We know there's people on different, across the political spectrum with different views. Let's hash out a solution. It's kind of amazing. If you had asked me 15 years ago, like, do you think we'd be in 2025 and still have no baseline privacy law in this country? I'd say that's crazy. Of course we will. We'll have to. We'll need to. Data will be too important. And yet we don't. And that's the kind of thing with the muscles that we have not built that we need to build for AI. The other thing that I'll just say is that would challenge the frothing libertarian that you are, Andy, or at least today.
That I'm playing on stage here right now.
We live in a very competitive geopolitical climate. Right. There are countries all over the world that want to succeed in this space. We have adversaries who are very, very savvy. It takes investment at times to be able to deal with the challenges that we face long term. And I mean collective investment as a society, things that the market won't necessarily do by itself. In the last 3 or 4 years, we made some really big bets, for example. $50 billion to bring back the semiconductor industry into the United States. $50 billion to say we're going to make sure every single person in America has access to high-speed, affordable broadband. I ran that $50 billion program. I can tell you a lot about the hard things about doing that. But those were choices we made among a lot of other choices, some of which we've talked about during the course of the day. And I would just pose to you, those are the kinds of choices that if you're managing a $30 trillion economy, occasionally there are things where we need collective action as a society.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because it's this beautiful issue, and you did a very good job of not saying the magic 2-word phrase industrial policy. But that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's a couple different flavors of industrial policy.
Right. And by the way, I'll just dive in really quickly to say, I was shocked when I showed up in this job in Washington. I've been trained, like many of us, to think industrial policy is not a good word. Like somebody said, don't use dirty words.
Oh.
Okay, industrial policy AF. I went to a hearing or a meeting, a closed-door meeting on Capitol Hill, probably in my first month on the job. And it was a bipartisan meeting. There were some senior senators from senior Democrats and senior Republicans. And the senior Republicans, people who are very well known in the world right now, all were talking about industrial policy. They use the phrase industrial policy.
In neutral or positive terms?
In positive terms, like we need more industrial policy.
Did they mean pork when they said that? Pork, barrel spending.
No, they meant hey, we need to be investing to beat China.
Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. And beating China is a nice place to start this discussion because, as you know, a huge proportion of the world's cutting-edge chips are made on an island that's a very short distance from China, and we keep on worrying about that for reasons that strike me as pretty good. So I think a lot of people would agree, for national security purposes, we probably do need some thoughtful, as you say, collective investment or incentives or subsidies to get the chip making on our fair shores. Great, so that's the CHIPS Act. The single biggest recipient of the CHIPS Act was Intel, which was a company that was kind of visibly circling the drain at the time that money was handed out and was really nowhere near the cutting edge of making chips anymore. That's the kind of thing that makes my... there's an actual frothing at the mouth libertarian, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of thing that makes me a little skeptical of this whole thing.
Right. And I think the thing we have to understand is that it's hard to do this.
Come on. It's not hard not to give Intel $9 billion when they're that far from the cutting edge.
And who would you have given it to, and how would you have spent that money?
Maybe I would have given less money out. TSMC was number 2, which seems like a pretty good choice. But that's an example of the distortions that I think we always see come up when the government starts doling out money to particular companies. It strikes me that capital allocation is usually middling to bad. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I'll say I'm the wrong person to. I didn't work on the CHIPS Act. And
we're getting to you, my friend. Don't worry.
And so I'm the wrong person to sort of explain why those investments were made. I guess my reflection would though be we have this strange zero tolerance for failure out of government that we don't require in the private sector. And this is something that I said a lot to the folks who were managing the portfolio of grants that we were making on broadband, which is there's so much worry in government about anything going wrong because this leads to this incredible caution and conservatism because
come on, Alan, come on. Misallocating 20% of the total budget is not a minor thing going wrong.
What is that? 20% of the
of the 50 billion.
Of the 50.
I'm hammering away.
For the right.
Into Intel. Like,
yeah.
That's just a misallocation. That's not like the bet that didn't go well.
Again, I don't know enough to be able to. There are very good people who tell you why Intel was an important, recipient of it, and why Intel is Intel's been an amazing company. It is an amazing company. I'm hopeful that they'll do well.
So
I don't know if but I will say zero tolerance for failure is not great, and I don't know enough to be able to tell you why.
You know what else isn't great? You know what, my friend? Well, you know what else? Zero tolerance for Elon is also not great, and this gets to your home turf, because I hear you say that there are things that the market won't do, and maybe the market would not have brought semiconductor manufacturing back onshore to the United States on its own. That's a really interesting question. It strikes me that the market suddenly did start providing ample bandwidth from space with this constellation of Starlink satellites overhead. And I think you could have saved a lot of money by giving people who wanted broadband and lived in rural America just a good old Starlink voucher. And I've talked to you about this, you don't love that idea.
Well, first of all, half step back, why did we even have a program like this? I mean, we had a program like this because, here we are in 2025. Internet is really it's the OG platform, I would argue, right? It's a very incredibly important thing for success in this world. And there are still millions and millions of households across the country who cannot get high-speed internet service. They're considered unserved.
They have zero options.
They have zero options in the market. And Congress said...
hold on, not anymore.
Not anymore,
but
in 2022 they didn't. And the question is also, Congress then said, okay, here's $48 billion for a bunch of different programs, largely administered through the states, with the goal of providing everybody in America with reliable, affordable, high-speed internet service. And high-speed internet service had a definition, right? In this case, it's 100 megabits per second up and 100 megabits per second down, 20 megabits per second up, low latency, less than 100 millisecond latency. It was not clear that Starlink, and it's still not clear that the low Earth orbit satellites can always provide that and can provide it at scale for the millions of households. We're talking, in excess of 10 million households that are unserved or underserved that they can provide it at scale. The other thing that Congress really rightly noted was, hey, we're investing this money, we want to build, and we're only going to do it once, right? We're not going to spend $50 billion again. So you really need to make this a network that's going to be resilient to need over time. I will say then,
has anyone in Congress ever heard of Moore's Law? That's not the way high tech works. You don't build things once that last forever in a high tech ecosystem.
Well, we don't, but we also don't do big infrastructure projects. Now, you could argue that we should be doing regular investments in our infrastructure, but we don't really do big infrastructure projects that regularly. They tend to be kind of once in a generation things. And we can build big things. We did rural electrification, we built the interstate highway system. This was, I think in some ways, this is our generation's big infrastructure project. Low Earth orbit satellite does not grow, does not provide the resilience, does not provide the same kind of service that a terrestrial service will provide. It's a miracle what we can do with low Earth orbit satellites now. Hats off to these companies. And the remote companies.
So far, it's not these companies. I'm going to bring this up again. It's one, and it's run by a person who seemed kind of unpopular in the previous administration.
Yeah, but I think the truth is, the hope is, and the expectation is that there will be more than one. Kuiper.
Well, not if you don't start handing out money
and
to
some
the
of
terrestrial satellite company.
The states,
previous you, I mean.
The states that have started going through this process of giving out their money,
right.
For example, Nevada is a great example. All of their low Earth orbit satellite money, and we built a system that basically did do low Earth orbit satellite. All of their low Earth orbit satellite money went to Kuiper. So they're placing a bet that Kuiper within the next year is going to have a service that can serve the people of Nevada. I think the key point here is, as a public servant, we try to be humble in the face of things we don't know. And in the past, we've seen continuous growth in demand for bandwidth. And so it seemed that if you're going to build a system to connect everybody in the country, we should start by trying to make sure we get everybody a system where we can afford it.
This is my skeptical face.
Where we can afford it, that will grow over time the way
This feels like saying you can't have an airport because you need a spaceport.
Well, but the thing is, we can build the spaceport, and we're building it. The fact is, if you look at Nevada, West Virginia, Louisiana, Delaware, these were all states that, by the time I left office, had done their allocations, were about to give out their money, were giving out their money to companies, and a lot of it was fiber, and some of it was satellite. And that's the kind of choice that actually I would think a good libertarian would say we should let states make. We, the federal government, didn't dictate what they do. West Virginia, satellite doesn't work so well in a lot of geographies.
All right, I think we've beat the bandwidth horse to death. We have about 10 minutes left before I think we're going to open this up.
I will just say though, I think it does speak to this question of doing these things in government. My observation is some of this work is hard, and you just have to roll up your sleeves and do it. And we heard it in some of the other panels today too. And if there's anything, it speaks to the need to give ourselves some grace, but also give ourselves some time to make sure that we are building things that take more than just a year or two to build. I think it was another Warren Buffett quote. 9 women who are pregnant cannot give birth to a baby in a month. Right? Like some things just take time. You can't scale them, and in the same way. And so I'm hopeful, by the way, that this administration will see we handed them the ball on the 5-yard line here. They just need to run it in and get everybody connected in the next few years.
The question is which 5-yard line?
Oh, well, I have a strong
that was unfair,
sense.
And I apologize.
This is a tough crowd, or a tough.
All right, let's move on a little bit because
okay.
In your opening remarks, you used a couple other words that I want to come back to. You talked about governance, and you talked about privacy. And if we broaden out our discussion beyond America and we look at the other main member, I believe, of Team Liberal Democratic West, the post-war order that has just brought peace, prosperity to more people around the world than I think has ever happened before. That other member of Team Liberal Democratic West is Europe, is the EU.
Right.
And they have taken a much more, let's call it an aggressive, an interventionist, an upstream stance on issues of governance, particularly around technology, and around privacy. And their capstone piece of legislation about that is GDPR. And the research around GDPR has been piling up. I forget when it went into effect, but for at least a half dozen years now. And it's fairly clear, and it does not look really good. There's been a noticeable decline in innovation, in venture capital investment in related areas, in the number of apps that you have access to. The enforcement's been pretty weak and pretty uneven, and the benefits, we have a greater sense of privacy, are fairly nebulous. And there's this general trade-off.
Besides that, what's wrong?
Yeah, of concrete harms for nebulous, really hard to pin down benefits that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And I get a tiny bit nervous because it doesn't feel to me like our European friends have learned a lot from that because they've passed the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act and now the AI Act. And I keep on hearing variations on the theme that leadership in technology means leadership in regulating that technology, and that really makes me uncomfortable. Do you share my discomfort there?
Well, I think, a couple of different things I do share here. One is I think we in the US really do want and need our partners in Europe to succeed in this world. We do better, we're stronger when we have a broad, I would say, liberal democracies of the world that are coming and building technology with the values and vision that we all share. and Europe has struggled, and there are a lot of different reasons. We talked the Draghi report, a recent report from leadership in Europe, kind of outlines a lot of the root causes, perhaps, of some of those issues. And GDPR has been, is not the model we would have adopted if we had a privacy law here in the United States. And so, what I have said to some of our European colleagues, and I think, is that we hope they can find ways to do the things that their values dictate. Everybody's got different values in different places around the world. It is not wrong for countries or regions to feel like they want to protect the privacy of their citizens or the security of their citizens. We hope they can do it in a way that also is consistent with good innovation. And that's the balance that I don't think they've necessarily gotten right. And you can see them now. I think they understand that too. And even as the AI Act is now coming into force, there's a whole question about how they're going to enforce it, because I think they too realize they don't want to do anything that really destroys innovation on the continent.
Do you see Europe heading in the right direction or the wrong direction with innovation, entrepreneurship, and a high-tech ecosystem?
The people that I have, my counterparts in Europe that I dealt with when I was in government, I think they are moving, they themselves have the right ideas and are moving in the right direction. It's hard, governance is hard, but I think I felt a growing recognition that they need to strike this balance in a slightly different place. And I think you've heard that in some of the conversations lately, especially around the AI Act. That said, I'll just also say, this is another place where we need good leadership. And when I said, there's been a little bit of a governance vacuum, we didn't provide the world with an alternative to the GDPR. We didn't have our American, how do we do innovation and protect privacy, compromise that we could pose out there and say, do this instead. And we need to do that hard work. But I'm going to turn the table and ask you, but since we talk, what do you think they ought to be doing to bring that kind of innovation back? Because we do need them to succeed, and there are very few of the kind of companies that, that are the name brand companies, the name brand innovators that have been really successful there.
So, like you, I read the Draghi
Siemens
report.
notwithstanding, of course.
For our colleagues from Siemens.
Right.
Like you, I read the Draghi report when it came out last fall, and I was really pleasantly surprised at how kind of blunt and hard-hitting it was for an official EU communique. And in particular, I was reading and I learned things. Draghi pointed out that in 2000, if American labor productivity was at 100, Europe was at the EU was at about 95. That gap had been closing throughout most of the post-war period. Now, if America's at 100, the EU is at 80. That gap is getting bigger, and there's no good story you can tell about that. He also said something I said wild. He said there are currently no EU companies started from scratch in the past 50 years. So, for example, ASML doesn't count. It's the result of a merger. Started from scratch in the past 50 years with a market capitalization of at least $100 billion. There are none. I thought, okay, that's not good. But then I thought, what if you took it down an order of magnitude? And so I did a visualization of the ecosystem of European from-scratch companies less than 50 years old, worth at least $10 billion, publicly traded companies, compared to that of the United States. And the definition of a really interesting question is one that you've got a slide for. So could we put that slide up? So that's the comparison. The small cluster there is the EU. The large cluster is America. The green bubbles are considered in high-tech industries. The blue is everything else. And I believe there are 14 bubbles total in that EU cluster. And I can't read my own fine print, but there are, let's say, there are a lot more than that in the US cluster. We also took it back one step because if you're going to become one of these big green bubbles, you probably need to be, the next generation of these bubbles is going to come from today's unicorns. And those are privately held companies valued at least $1 billion. So here's a parallel visualization with a different color scheme, and I apologize. Here's a parallel visualization of the unicorn ecosystem in the US versus the EU. This comparison is not as stark it's still not really good. And two things to keep in mind, there is a lot of drop-off between unicorn and $100 billion. There's going to be a lot of attrition in these two clusters. And then the single biggest cluster in the EU is a company called Stripe, which is dual headquartered in the EU and US. So we had to split that bubble up. But they were started by two Europeans, two Irish brothers, but they are a US born and bred company in all but headquarters location. So I see these kinds of comparisons, and I wish I saw more grounds for optimism, and I wish the Draghi report, as hard-hitting as it was on the diagnosis, I wish it were equally hard-hitting on the cure, because the thing that I think he put front and center was we need to spend more money. We need more public investment in technology. And the EU is within, I believe, 15 or 20% of total U.S. public investment, basic R&D, doled out by the federal government. I don't think that's the problem. I think there's something about labor force rigidities and excess regulation and just this kind of thicket that confronts innovators and entrepreneurs that is denser, a lot denser in Europe. And that as I look at all these successive acts, I don't see that thicket getting cleared out. I see this persistent fondness for trying to regulate the stuff when it's very, very new and young and the path is uncertain, to the point that you've got your own countries inside the EU begging for relief as the act comes into focus. I don't love that recipe.
This is, I mean, it's a stunning statistic. I do wonder if our colleagues in Europe would necessarily say this is their only goal. To produce unicorns, but if that's the metric we want to...
Sure, but the Draghi report was explicit, and it was explicit about Europe's prosperity and Europe's economic growth. There are other reasons to do basic research. I completely agree with that. The Draghi report was about national competitiveness, economic growth, and productivity growth.
And I'll say, and again, I'm speaking from the point of view of somebody who was just in government in the US, we want Europe to succeed. I don't think we can dictate to them. I think this is actually the kind of thing that is helpful for policymakers inside trying to figure out the path through. I mean, it also speaks to the collective problem we have from the competition that's coming from other parts of the world, in particular China.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about China unless there's a question about it from the floor. So speaking of that, let's throw this open. If you have questions for Alan, or I guess for me, we'd love to hear them. And please keep in mind, I'm sure this has been said several times today, but the definition of a good question is that it is clear, it is short, and it is a question. Marshall, can you model good behavior for us on this front?
We will try. Specifically, since you asked for a China question, I was going to give you exactly that. So I worry that we're looking a little bit too much in the rearview mirror comparing U.S. and Europe where we've had an advantage. I ask you to look in the forward windshield. There was a fascinating report by David O'Toole, economist at MIT, in New York Times last week, comparing technology in U.S. and China. I will start with the facts before giving you the question. And he's comparing.
We're already kind of failing the concision test here, Marshall.
So continuing the failure, the China leads in electric batteries.
Some people are immune to nudges. Have you noticed that?
Electric batteries, hardware accelerators, optical communications, superconductors, circuit design, natural language processing, high-performance computing, and they're about to lead in quantum computing. What's changed? And what would we do differently in order to keep up or get further ahead?
You want to go first?
No, go ahead.
First of all, China is a worthy adversary with an amazing high-tech ecosystem in some areas that should frighten us. I personally don't know if I should care if they make the world's solar panels or not. I do think I should care if they make the world's drones or not, especially given what we've learned in Ukraine these past couple of years. So there's real grounds for concern now. I don't think your career is quite old enough, Marshall, but mine is to remember the MIT Commission on Industrial Productivity, which was releasing reports kind of between 1988 and 1990 about the indomitable Japanese lead in these incredibly strategic industries and how we were all going to be working for Japanese-owned companies if America didn't get its act together. I've been shaped by that event. It was when I was a graduate student here. And I'm a little bit less concerned if you can correctly cite off a litany of sectors where China is in the lead. If we drew my graphs for China, they would be actually very increasingly lopsided instead of converging these days. And I saw these amazing statistics about how, like you know, the world's best venture capitalists showed up in China the first decade of the century and kickstarted the Chinese high-tech ecosystem. They have largely, the foreign investors have largely left the country. And as a member of Team Liberal Democratic West, very few things make me happier than watching Xi Jinping try to re-centralize the Chinese economy. I am long-term negative on the ability of authoritarian states and centralized economic systems to do sustained real innovation.
I would just add, I mean, I think we underestimate China at our peril.
Yep.
Having just been in government, I'll just say there's a lot of reasons to feel that they are being very successful in this geopolitical competition. They have very long time horizons. They invest very strategically. I'll just talk about, we touched on rare earths as an interesting example even during the course of the day. They've been incredibly strategic about their approach there. It's a great example. And I'll give another example. I did a lot of work in government on 5G and the question of the global competition for 5G deployments. You know, there are really only a handful of companies today that now make the cell phone, the tower equipment. Huawei and ZTE are really dominant in sales around the world. Ericsson, others are very good companies. They build excellent products, but China has really figured out that recipe for how to sell in other places around the world. If you're building out your 5G infrastructure in a small country in the developing world, you're almost certainly going with Huawei, as much as we've been trying to change that tide. And that lesson and that analogy is something we really need to take to heart when we think about the success of, sort of, for example, the smaller AI players, the DeepSeeks and others who are being very successful out there at building products, not necessarily that are going to be the biggest frontier models, but are going to be products that the rest of the world's going to want to buy.
Yep.
So how are we going to beat them? How are we going to beat them? You didn't answer. How are we going to beat them?
Nor will we, because we're going to move on to another question.
But that's
Ma'am,
okay.
over to you.
My question is going to be following along that, which is when I joined the federal government, the one thing that really shocked me was the way in which we do appropriations, where basically the Senate and Congress and all that do their thing, and I'm not allowed to talk to them as a member of the agency because then I'm lobbying, right? And so it's the equivalent of if you have a private sector company where the CFO sits outside from the rest of the leadership and then lobs money in. And when it happened to us, we got $500 billion. We had to hire 1,000 people at DOE just to get the money out the door. And Congress is really upset at us if we don't get the money out and we have any kind of carryover. So our incentive is to get the money out the door, not how we got out the door and does it make sense, but get it out the door. Now you look at China and they integrate, right, the way they deploy capital with a strategy. And they act more like a sane private sector company than we do. So how do we win against a place that is acting in a sane private sector way versus us, where every 2 years people are worried about it getting reelected, and as we change things, the private sector doesn't have certainty around what we're doing. So would love to know if you felt the same weirdness, and also what do we do to actually fix it?
Yeah, I definitely felt the weirdness. That is only really as you would say, scratching the surface of how difficult it is. And I'd say this as somebody coming out of being an executive in the private sector to being asked to run, and stand up a $50 billion grant program. And there's so many moments where you're saying, what, we have to do it like this? And there are a lot of those. But I don't think the answer is to say then, I would just humbly submit. The answer is not to say, well, government can't do it then, and we just have to give up and only rely on the private sector. I think the answer is we need to we continue to push ourselves to make this system work better. And in some ways, and I think there is some good coming from the kind of revisiting all these procurement rules the right rules, right? I think we do need to be thinking about how to do that better. And at the same time, recognizing that we've just got to get better at doing the thing that bothered me in appropriations was, you can't get a long-term budget. You've got a budget. If you're lucky, you get a year budget. And a lot of times now with these continuing resolutions, you only find out what your budget is halfway through the year when you have to spend it. And we have a strong push to spend it by the end of the year. But again, I come back to, we got to make it better. And I think competitively, what we need to do is lean into our strengths.
But on that front,
Yeah.
did I hear you correctly that there have been green shoots in some of the procurement processes that we go through, that they're getting a little better?
Yeah, and I think we're right, and some people have said this, and it's been a little controversial because I know the politics out there is very intense right now. But one thing that I hope for in this current administration is there has been a strong desire to really revisit some of the things that have made government too slow at doing what it does. And we've talked about things like permitting reform to be able to do some things. That's something that a lot of Democrats care about and Republicans care about. But there are other things about procurement, about how we do appropriations that could be a lot better. Maybe.
And the fact that Anduril and Palantir exist, this feels like good news for the defense tech sector.
Yeah, we need to be. We were very cautious, I will say, in the in the Biden administration, when ChatGPT came out, and there was a lot of people saying things like AI is dangerous. AI, we need to be very worried. And I think the initial reaction from government was to go too slow and to say, wait a second, let's really stop using this internally until in fairness, till we figure out the privacy and security and safety issues that we need to. We probably overcorrected and then started to move back, and now I think the government is in a full-throated, hey, we need to use these tools too. And that will be part of the solution for government, I think, is how to get better at technology and how to use the tools.
Over to you, sir.
Hi, my name is Ben Parker. I just graduated with my MBA from Wharton, and I also got a master's in international studies. So this was the session that I was looking forward to the most, for sure.
Did we disappoint?
No, you did not. I've been very
haven't gotten
happy.
this question yet.
So from the business perspective, we've been seeing obviously like a big kind of trend down in globalization, more towards reshoring, friendshoring. And I'm kind of curious for your perspective on what mistakes you think companies are making right now when it comes to geopolitical risk, and what some best practices are for trying to avoid those mistakes.
Well, I think, I'm trying to think about what mistakes people are making. I think I'll just say very quickly, because I know we have one more question and time. It's a challenging environment to work in right now. I think there's a lot, somebody earlier talked about uncertainty and how it's really tough for businesses when there's uncertainty out there. And we face a lot of global uncertainty. And so I don't really have a magic bullet answer to your question about how companies should best navigate this, or even what they're doing wrong. I think there's a tendency, I think a lot of companies tend to overestimate the rationality of the political process and think that at the end of, I know that sounds a little disappointing. The political process has a rationality, a set of rules that it makes sense within that process. I think people bring the market rules to bear and think, people in government will never do X, that's too crazy, and yet sometimes X happens. So I think beware of expecting a business rationality to dictate how governments around the world act.
I love the question, and when you spend time in high tech, you see a lot of herd behavior. You see money chasing the latest thing and over-investing in this, and for example, Web3 was a period of collective delusion as far as I can tell. And I'm not sure how many of these coins out there are actually worth anything. So nuttiness like that kind of happens. But in general, I vehemently agree with Alan here that this is a time of deep uncertainty and self-inflicted pointless uncertainty about how much are things going to cost me somewhere down the road? As a decision maker about where to allocate capital and where to set up your supply chains, it's incredibly hard to answer that question now when tariffs are yo-yoing up and down on something like a daily basis. And Justin Wolfers, who's a really good economist at Michigan, kind of gives these ongoing Econ 101 seminars on CNN, I believe, where he just talks about how that leads to reduced overall investment, especially long-term investment, which is exactly the opposite of what we need. We need to get this kind of nonsense out of the business decision-making environment so that people can do what they're supposed to do for a living and make rational decisions about where to put stuff. We're just going through a crazy time right now.
And I think another way of saying it is build for volatility, expect volatility, build for resilience. That's what we're going to need in the coming years.
So. All right, ma'am, you have the honor and burden of asking the day's final question. Please make it a bang-up final question.
Actually,
Okay,
Marshall paid me $100 to ask his question again.
All right, so the pressure's off, but we might not have time for Veral, so take us home, please.
Okay. So I'm Varsha Shukla. I am a PhD Innovation Fellow at Dartmouth College. I work with Professor Jeff Parker. And my question is actually just related to what we were talking about. Like in the previous couple of years, we have obviously seen global trend in tech fragmentation in some ways. Different countries are building different laws. Like India is building ONDC to bypass Amazon, or China's strengthening its closed digital policy, etc. Of course, you talked about the Europe acts and laws. But then my question is, how can in this growing, rising wave of digital sovereignty, we can build systems, either platforms or policies, that can, some way give these countries control, as well as foster innovation and trust, so that they're able to operate, interoperate in some ways, if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense, and I think it speaks to a number of things that are big tasks for us here. Somebody in an earlier panel talked about trust in the business environment. I think the same thing goes in the geopolitical environment. And so figuring out ways for countries to feel that their values will be respected, and that the needs of their citizens will be understood and protected and met. And so that is part of the task, partly for industry to be successful, and partly if we want our companies to be successful in the world. I think we also need to be willing to understand that a lot of countries are coming from a place of they do have their values. In Europe, for example, privacy is a fundamental right. It's different. In the United States, free speech is a bedrock principle, right? And the First Amendment is part of our Constitution. Different countries are going to take different approaches. Can we build governance systems? I think this is especially important for AI as we think ahead. Can we build our technology, and can we build governance for it that has the room to respect those different values but still promote innovation? And I think that is the hard work ahead of us. And it's not necessarily easy, sexy work. It's often easy to say either like, don't regulate at all because you'll stop innovation and we'll lose to China, or regulate a lot because that's what's going to make us interesting and different from others. Neither of those is probably the right answer. And so I guess my big plea or pitch in some ways is that we need more people, and people like you all in this room who are working on the technology, to also spend some time thinking about that governance piece and how we make it work for lots of different value systems out there.
That seems like a good note to end on. Alan, you're a great sport. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.